3, 2, 1, and you're live. Over to you, Hussein Bhai.
Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Salatu wassalamu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi ajma'in. Assalamu alaikum to all those viewers of Spiritual Solitude for another episode of Coping in Difficult Times. Alhamdulillah, today we are covering the topic of Islam and mental health. One of the reports that recently came out, SANE, a mental health charity, urged psychiatric services to be on red alert for a wave of patients struggling to deal with self-isolation. And of course, we know the coronavirus pandemic is having a profound and pervasive impact on global mental health. And there was a warning that was given by 24 specialists in a paper published by the Lancet Psychiatry. And one of the authors noted increased social isolation, loneliness, health anxiety, stress, and an economic downturn are a perfect storm to harm people's mental health and well-being. We have been covering how to deal with and manage grief and loss. And of course, last time we covered the topic of the power of hope. And we felt it important to cover this very important discussion that we need to have within our own communities and society at large, which is the mental health itself. But one particular angle that we want to take, especially coming from a faith background, is what does our faith, in this case Islam, say about mental health? Are there any answers that within our religion that we could find, or is there an attitude that we should have towards mental health that we could perhaps learn from? But certainly what we are seeing within our communities is reflective of wider society, which is that mental health is not taken as seriously. It is still a taboo. It is something that is to be hidden. It is not something that is out there in the open. And so therefore, it is a discussion that we need to have, because we know from our deen that mental health is not something that is to be seen in this way. Perhaps there are cultural norms that are dictating that. And especially at this time, there is no other time when we need to come out more and to have this discussion. And to start off our discussion this evening, I have no better person than Sister Aisha Aslam, who is the director of Sapoon Counseling Services. She's also a consultant, clinical supervisor, psychotherapist, an Islamic counselor, and of course, she's spoken internationally, an international speaker with over 15 years of experience working in mental health. So, Sister Aisha, thank you for joining us this evening. Our apologies, we had some technical glitches to start this session a little bit later than scheduled, but inshallah, hopefully we can really get the best out of this session with your introduction to this very important topic. So if you could take it away from here, inshallah. Thank you.
Thank you. I think it's part of the new normal, all these new tech issues that we're going to be facing. So it's just something we need to embrace. Rabbi shrah li sadri wa yassir li amri wahlul uqdatam min lisani yafqahu qawli. Assalamu alaikum, guys. It's really great to be here. I just want to say jazakallah khair to the organizers for creating this space for everybody. So is there any connection between Islam and mental health? And how is mental health addressed in Islam? And is it different to today's perspective? Can everyone see my PPT slide? I need to know how to change the screen, the slideshow. Okay, just bear with me.
Just simply click onto your PowerPoint. That should really do it normally.
Okay, inshallah. So today what we're going to be looking at is what is mental health, and having a better understanding of it, and sort of understanding it in more depth, and its connection to Islam, and what we can actually do now. So is there ways that we can make a difference, a positive difference in our lives and in other people's lives, inshallah. So just to tell you a little bit about myself, I actually set up Sapoon in 2006, and it was with this view of not wanting to compromise faith in treatment. And I remember many years ago when I studied psychology and psychotherapy, I was always told you can't mix faith with treatment. I remember speaking to my tutors, my teachers, my peers, going to the large governing counselling bodies, conferences, and everyone kept telling me the same thing. And it just didn't sit with me at all. So I decided to go against it, and I devised my own model called the Sapoon Model after doing a number of research in that sort of area. And alhamdulillah, we use that model and we train other people to use that model so that they can be able to help others. And funnily enough, last year, I was actually invited by one of the large counselling governing bodies, BACP and CPCAB, to talk about the Sapoon model and how we integrate faith in treatment. So it's really great to actually see this sort of shift taking place within counselling industries, recognising the importance of difference and diversity and faith and culture. So I'm glad I made my decision back then. And I actually did this because I wanted to make a difference in our communities. I wanted to be able to change the stigma of mental health and people's views towards counselling. I wanted people to know that they can talk about their problems, that they don't have to suffer in silence, but most importantly, that it's Islamic to help oneself in a confidential setting and to create that sort of safe space to empower people to live better lives. So I became inundated with clients and I decided to set up as an organization. So fast forward to date, alhamdulillah, we have over 10 therapists. We work with individuals, couples and families. We have offices in Manchester, Birmingham and London, and we work worldwide. As well as offering counselling, we also have a number of other projects. We have accredited counselling courses where we have 3 tutors. So if anybody was interested in integrating counselling skills or wanting to become a therapist, do get in touch. We have many different people on board. We have alamas, we have Muslim chaplains, we have imams, we have people who are in the corporate sector, people who want to sort of change careers. We have solicitors, lawyers, teachers, and people who are homemakers. And everyone's found it really beneficial. So we also train organizations internationally and nationally. Just before lockdown, I was actually in Thailand. We have volunteers on board, we work in partnership, and we deliver talks to the community, write articles and do podcasts. And actually next month, I'll be doing a talk on Islam and depression for the Dubai. So what is mental health? So according to the World Health Organization, it defines health as a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. So what this basically means is it's looking at the way a person functions on a day-to-day basis. It's looking at the way one thinks, how they feel, how they behave, how they handle stress, how they relate to others, how they make choices. So mental health actually has an impact on every stage of development, whether you're a child, adolescent, adult, or elderly, it has an impact on all aspects of our life. And as you can see, there's so many types of mental health concern. It goes across the board. Some of them you may be familiar with, and there'll be many things that we may not be familiar with. But each and every one of us will connect to some of these concerns at some point in our life. And mental health covers a spectrum. So there's mild forms, there's moderate forms, and severe forms. And this is something that I will touch on a little later on. But what I wanted to touch on is some of the key facts. So did you know that 1 in 4 people suffer from a mental health problem worldwide? And that's equivalent to splitting a room into 4 sections. And over 75% of people will have a mental health concern by the time they reach the age of 18. That's 3/4 of a room. And 50% by the time they become an adult. So when I saw these statistics, it was actually quite worrying that this is actually happening. And unfortunately, it is on the increase. And due to lockdown, we've actually noticed the pressures that people are going through, the changes, having to sort of multitask all different roles in one physical space. And of course, the number of losses that people are going through, it's creating a huge amount of mental health concerns for everybody. But it also illustrates that we all experience emotions. It's actually part of life. So we go through times where we feel excited, we're happy, and these are examples of positive mental health. But there's also times where we may go through struggles. So we go through stressful situations, whether it's an exam or we've got an interview or doing a webinar, or we have a family dinner with a number of guests. It can evoke feelings of anxiety and stress and worry. And what tends to happen is people usually get over those symptoms once the event has taken place. But at times, people just can't shift away from them feelings. They still have it, even though the event has gone. And this is when you notice that it's starting to affect people's lives. And some of the things you might notice is when someone may have a loss of interest or motivation in sort of things that they used to enjoy. So people who may have been very outgoing and very sort of smiley and jokey, talking a lot, wanting to be going to places, and now all of a sudden they don't have that joy, they don't have that interest any longer in doing these things. Or it could be the opposite, someone who was sort of an introvert and then has become quite irritable and aggressive, and you notice that huge change in their behavior. And these are some of the signs that you can notice that there's something going on for that particular person. But there's also situations where people may have gone through really difficult events in their life, such as childhood difficulties, or they've gone through a relationship breakdown or had an accident. All of this has an impact on our emotional well-being. So if you've actually been brought up and you were perhaps physically or emotionally abused, what may happen is we may continue that mirroring of that behavior in our lives. So this idea of what my mum and dad did, I'm going to be doing the same thing because that's how I was brought up and this is how I'm going to continue doing things. It's what we know. So whatever we know, we sort of mimic that behavior. But then there's other people who will actually say, I will never do it again. It's absolutely, what I went through, I'll never want somebody else to go through that. And what ends up happening is that whenever there are snippets of that sort of experience that comes in their current life, so maybe they hear someone talking really loudly, or they hear a bit of aggressiveness in their voice, in somebody's voice, they become really highly sensitive. And then they find it a real struggle to face confrontation or to face conflict. So they end up avoiding and escaping those situations, and they struggle in how to sort of manage them situations. And then there's others who may find it difficult just to make relationships. So they sort of keep people at an arm's length, and they sort of keep themselves far away. And it's this fear of not wanting to get hurt. So they keep this boundary up for themselves, and that's their way of coping. So what you notice is that people have different coping mechanisms when people have gone through difficulties in life. But what we also have to remember is that mental health is part of life. And it's about recognizing that when it affects us, we need to start to address it. So let's look a little bit at Islam and mental health. So what you can see is mental health was actually very advanced in the early years of the Islamic world, and in particular in the golden age of Islam, in between the 7th and 13th century in particular, there was many discoveries that Muslims made, and that also included psychology, psychiatry, and psychotherapy. Ibn Sina, also known as Avicenna, a Persian polymath, and Ali al-Razi, a physician and a philosopher, they noticed the connection between physical sickness and one's psychological well-being, and vice versa. So they saw the connection between the mind and the body. So if someone was physically not well, they saw that that would naturally have an impact on a person's emotional well-being. That if they weren't well, they will feel a bit sad and they'll feel down. Or if someone was feeling really sad or stressed out emotionally, that can have an impact on a person's physical well-being. And what they actually did at that time is they set up the very first psychiatric hospital in 705 CE in Baghdad, and then in Cairo in 805 CE. And they also tackled a lot of the misconceptions that were there at the same time in the medieval Europe, which is also known as the Dark Ages. And they viewed symptoms of mental health associated only with demons and jinn related. So what you notice is that there was a really big shift in attitudes. There was a difference in attitudes as to how people addressed mental health in that time. And when we think a little bit about our community, sometimes we do go into that position that we shift the blame, problems, or whatever someone's going through when we notice that change in their behavior, that it's gin related and not necessarily taking responsibility. And sometimes that is the case, it can be gin related, but 9 times out of 10, it's more psychological based from what we've seen, from the work that we've done. So if we just look at this sort of research that's taking place, researchers used to see that religion is detached to psychology and science, but current neuroscientific research actually shows Islamic practice directly affects the cognitive functions of the brain. So a study done by Andrew Newberg, he looked at the brain image scans and he saw the changes in activity between a person who engages in prayers and meditates and does spiritual activities compared to a brain that's at rest, so one who's not doing anything. And he in particularly looked at salah, so a person who's praying. And when someone's praying, what they're doing is they're really focusing on God, their creator, the afterlife, and they're really sort of just focusing on the words and being in the present, that mindfulness state. And they're not focusing on materialism or worldly matters. And what he stated is that there is a wisdom in prayer because it actually reduces anxiety and stress. Whereas when you focus on worldly matters, it actually increases stress and anxiety in people's lives. He also looked at the idea of zikr, this idea of focusing on Allah's names, his characteristics, and repeating it. And it actually creates this feeling of ease in people's lives, and it creates a closer connection to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And if you can actually see on the sort of scan, just how there's a certain part of the brain, the frontal lobe, which is specifically focused on attention, that it's a lot more stimulated, it's a lot more active when someone's engaging in prayer compared to when someone is not engaging in prayer. So it shows you that there is a big change, there's difference in that activity at that time. You can see technology is not my strength, so just bear with me. So what does this tell us? So it actually tells us that regular prayer, zikr, reciting God's names, the recitation of the Quran, focusing on God and not worldly matters, it actually improves the brain, the cognitive functions of the brain by 10 to 15% by this study. And what he noticed is that people who engaged in spirituality, they had better concentration levels. They were able to focus and be more attentive compared to those who didn't engage in prayers. And they were also able to adapt to change, this idea of plasticity, that they were easily able to adapt to change, whereas those who didn't pray, that they found that quite a struggle in their lives. It was difficult for them to adjust. So focusing on something can actually become one's reality. So this idea of if you really strongly pray and you get through a tough time, or you really want to stop feeling sad, it may become your reality because it's really embedded in your brain. You're constantly thinking in that context. And Newberg, he suggested that the Islamic belief prayers is sometimes an answer for a lot of psychological illnesses, and it can be applied in some of the cases. So sharing with a person some of the struggles that you're going through, what they do, praying, can actually help in their well-being. So if you know somebody who is struggling, and you know that they're praying and they're doing things, they're reading the Quran, they may feel really helpless that they just can't get through it. But actually just sharing with them some of this research, well, actually there's research to show that you're actually bringing a lot of more positivity in your life. You're becoming a lot more attentive. You're creating more active stimulation in your brain. It's better for your well-being. This can really provide a lot of comfort and a lot of ease for a person, knowing that they're actually doing something to help themselves. So let's look a little bit at our community, because although this is great, we have this research, but sometimes within our community, I don't know if you've ever noticed, but whenever there's someone who has a mental health concern, whether they're going through depression or anxiety, or they've been abused, or they've just gone through a divorce. How do we respond? What do we do? And there was three sort of key areas that came into my mind that I was aware of, and also just sort of looking at it from a wider perspective, is culturally, people take this position of associating mental health with stigma. This idea of they have to stay away from that person. It's really negative. We don't want that association with us. This idea of respect and reputation. And I had a client who was about 18. She suffered from obsessive compulsive disorder, constantly washing her hands and cleaning, always in the toilet for hours, constantly in this sort of really tense, heightened state. And whenever her family would have guests come round to her house, they would make sure that she was locked in her room. So just imagine the sort of message her parents are giving her. It's a message of that it's a shameful act. And they also stated, well, your siblings will never get married. If people see you in this state, you can't be around other people when you're like this. So they had a really negative view that was sort of imposed upon her. And she was also in this really helpless position. She was struggling internally. She couldn't break away from this, and she didn't have that support at all. And it was just making the situation far worse for her. And this is where we need to start to change our attitudes. And then there's also those who have a lack of education. They just don't know what mental health is. And when someone goes through that sort of position, they tend to sort of keep away and sort of carry on as normal. But even that in itself can sort of give a message to somebody that, oh, look, they don't really care, they're not worried, or they're not supportive in any shape or form. So no, doing nothing also speaks volumes. And Islamically and humanely as Muslims, we know the reward is so huge. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala loves the one who supports his creation. So in our deen, it already emphasizes on the importance of being able to support others, whether that's physical or mental, emotional, psychological, whatever you want to call it. Whenever someone is struggling, we should be there to try and support them. And I just wanted to sort of touch a little bit on some of the myths that exist when it comes to mental health. And unfortunately, they exist and they cause more harm than good. So sometimes not only just what the community think and how that can compound a person, but also the individual might actually feel like they're going crazy. They may feel like this is really strange and it's a really uncomfortable feeling to be going through. What does that mean? Does it mean that there's something wrong with me? But in actual fact, it's actually very normal to have some of these emotions and feelings that you go through. And that's something I talk a lot about with my clients. Sometimes people think they might die from it. So some of the physical symptoms can be unbearable. So when you think a little bit about a panic attack or going through anxiety, that heart is racing, you're breathing really deeply, and you find it really difficult to get a grasp of air. The research actually shows that nothing is going to happen to you at all. There's nothing that's going to have an impact on your physical body in any shape or form, but it's just a really uncomfortable feeling. And sometimes people think something terrible is going to happen. So when we're in that horrible, uncomfortable state, we have the worst fear inside us, and we think that something terrible is going to happen to us. And the reality is that it's just a thought, and it's not a fact whatsoever. It's just these uncomfortable feelings. We find it very unbearable to sort of deal with. But what we do is we go into the tense position rather than sort of focusing on sort of reducing that tension for us. So all of this just makes the situation worse. But also within our community, we have this attitude that if you have mental health, it's due to you have lack of faith or you don't trust in Allah. And this doesn't help someone when you say that to them. Turning to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the best of cures. There's no doubt about that. And research shows how this aids in one's well-being. And I mentioned one example, but it's the how. It's how you integrate that, how you bring that message to that person who's going through difficulties. And the importance is that we need to support and not judge as a community. We need to stop marginalizing people with this banner of Islam. You don't have stronger man, you're so weak. And again, I just don't understand how that helps. It makes a person feel worse and not better. You may feel like you're doing your Islamic duty, but you don't actually know what that person is going through. So for example, if someone has low self-esteem and you say to them, you need to pray more, and you're doing it with good intent, but that can be interpreted by that person, oh great, they think I'm a terrible Muslim, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala hates me, everyone thinks I'm weak, I'm no good, see, I'm just terrible. And we can't see this. This is the internal dialogue that that person is going through and tormenting themselves. Even on social media, we see it. When there's lots of WhatsApp groups and Facebook, Instagrams, lots of comments being made or not being made, it has an impact on our well-being, especially our youth. And we hear about a lot of research that's been taking place on how it impacts on themselves and their self-esteem. And it made me reflect on, did the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, how did he address issues? What did he do? And he was, subhanAllah, he was so compassionate, he was kind, and he was loving. So the key is the how we address people. And this is paramount when it comes to supporting someone's well-being. And I just want to highlight that it's absolutely normal to have these feelings and emotions of anger, feeling down, feeling anxious, sad in situations. And I come across quite often culturally that people are told they can't cry if someone passes away, or if they're going through struggles in their life. They can't display their emotions, especially if they have children around. You can't show that to them. And again, it's this idea of the message you're getting is you have to repress them emotions. You have to put it under the carpet, and you just got to carry on and put a different face on. But what you're doing is you're not addressing the issue. And what happens later on is it manifests in different shapes of form. You might become more bitter, you may become more irritable, you may not have as much patience later on in life. And then it all stems from this attitude of not being able to sort of express or resolve and address your issues, but having to sort of just put it under the carpet and just move on and carry on in life. And we also recognize that in the Quran and the Hadith that the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he illustrated, he showed that he had tears. He expressed his sadness when Khadija radiallahu anha passed away, when his children passed away. And he also displayed when he was angry, that you would see his face was red, but he wouldn't utter anything at that time. So it shows us, these examples show us that the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the person who had the most strongest of iman, the highest of iman, he showed emotions and he showed ways of how he coped in these difficult situations. And I have cases where I see people feeling really guilty and worthless as a Muslim. And as a therapist and as a sister, it breaks my heart to know that sometimes as a community, we can be really harsh with our words and we justify our actions, but not realizing the damage that it can really play on a person's life. And I just want to share with you, on our website, we have an article called Muslims Can Never Be Depressed. And it was from one of our clients who went and studied in Medina, and he was going through a lot of mental health struggles, and one of his teachers had shared with him that Muslims can never be depressed. And when he had that information, it just really had such a knock-on effect on him, thinking, I'm doing all these things, but yet I'm still not a good person. And this is where we've got to shift our attitudes. So how can we sort of apply Islam to support somebody? What can we do? So some examples that I give when I work with clients is I talk a little bit about this idea of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he doesn't burden a soul that one cannot bear. So the reality is when we're going through hardships, we sometimes think we just can't handle it, it's too much. And we sort of question it as well. Why is this happening? And maybe have feelings of anger. But what we also need to remember is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he is the best of planners. And we've also got to look at what is the wisdom, what is the gem that you can take away from this difficult situation that you might be going through. So maybe in that difficult situation, it helped you to get closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or maybe it helped you to connect with people you haven't connected with for such a long time. And you sort of formulated a different friendship or a different relationship with someone. And this is what's brought a bit of different positivity in your life. And this idea of tawakkul, trusting in Allah. So passing on your worries onto him and just letting go and just saying, okay, I leave this in Allah's hands. I'm not going to worry or stress about it. It can be truly liberating and healing. And I remember a client of mine, she had her struggles with her family, and she wasn't able to sort of She always felt she was being criticized, put down. She didn't feel like her voice was heard, and she was always struggling, and she was always trying to do so many different things. And then it got to a point where she was at her lowest of low, and she just said, I'm just going to leave it in Allah's hands. And the following day, so many changes took place, and she just felt like she was healed. That feeling of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala helping her, it happened. And this is this idea of we just have to have that tawakkul whenever it happens, or in a way that we may not imagine it to happen. It's about having that trust in him, that he knows best. So some of these examples can be things that we can talk about, but it is done in a way where you're supporting that client rather than judging that person. Now, I finally just wanted to touch with an image. So in this image, what you can see is a man, he's on top of the cliff, and he's got a big rock on top of him. And then there's an image of a woman who's at the bottom of the cliff, and she's falling, and he's trying to lift her up. And she can't see the rock on top of him, and he can't see the snake that's there next to the woman. And she's thinking to herself, why can't this man not use his strength and pull me up quicker? He's taking too long. And he's thinking, why can't she use her energy and just pull and do something? And the moral of the story is that we just don't know what a person is going through. We judge, and it happens all the time. Someone says something, we misinterpret it, or we think the worst. We see it in text messages. We see it sometimes in conversations. If someone's not married or they've not had a child, we judge what's wrong with them. There must be something that's happening. There's some reason behind this. We get so interested in the judging rather than the supporting. And in particular, in Ramadan, for example, if someone's not fasting, we always ask that question, are you fasting? Why? What's the reason? So again, there's this judgment, and if it's not based on the sort of elements that we know that is acceptable, that it's because you're pregnant or you're diabetic or elderly, then it's exempt. But if it's to do with something else, or they just don't want to share it with you, then there is this feeling of having to say, well, it is a sin that you're not fasting, and it's wrong if you don't do it. And I had a client who had an eating disorder, and she was strongly advised by her GP to not fast. And she was going through that process of having regular meals, and that was part of her therapy. But her family didn't really understand what was going on and what she had to go through, and her community, and she always was told that she's wrong and it's not good. The GP doesn't know anything. You need to do what is required of our religion. So she felt really compelled. She felt pressured. She didn't have the support, so she decided to fast. And she actually, the following after 1 day or 2 days of fasting, she relapsed and she almost died as a result of that. So this is what I mean, the repercussions of what we say and do. It might be with good intent, but the consequences can be so severe. So in order to avoid risk of mental health concerns, we need to, as a community, start to support each other, put a smile on one's face, spending time, helping out with someone's errands if they're struggling. Listening makes a big difference in people's lives. We're so busy, we don't have that time for each other. And it's great during lockdown to see this incredible act of kindness that's taking place everywhere, alhamdulillah, and for providing webinars for the community, alhamdulillah. And I really do hope that this carries on going forward, inshallah. And I just want to say that I hope you all like my PPT, because my children helped me with getting the slides all sorted out. So I just want to say to Isra and Amani, I'm very blessed to have them, and just to sort of share that, because they wanted me to share that on my webinar today. So I'm Aisha Aslam from Sapoon Counselling Services. If you do want to get involved or get in touch, email us on info@sapoon.co.uk or the other social media platforms. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protect us all and help us to help each other, and may we be able to please our Creator. Ameen.
Jazakallah khair, Sister Aisha. If you want to just come out of the sharing and then just want to just touch upon a couple of things that you mentioned in your presentation. First of all, that you mentioned a number of myths that exist, and the various reasons why lack of education to the cultural side that kind of impedes us from being able to have a real understanding of mental health. From the time that you've started till now, have you seen a change in attitude? Are we going somewhere? That would be the first question.
I would say we are, but there are differences geographically. So within London, definitely there's this diversity, there's a lot of groundwork taking place within the communities, a lot of emphasis on conversations about mental health. And in particular, in the past few years, the government has heavily talked about mental health and put lots of strategies in place. So people are becoming a lot more educated and are aware of what mental health is. Imams are now starting to talk about it in khutbahs as well. Masjids are offering counselling services. In 2006, however, it was still very much a taboo issue, like you mentioned at the beginning. But there are still areas up north and other places where they still have very closed communities and they don't necessarily want to integrate or mix with others. And there may be very valid reasons for that. Again, it's something they're not familiar with. They may have had a difficult experience. It's the way the community is in where they live. So I guess the answer is yes, and it is improving, definitely, but there are still places where it's not so dominant. And when I think about internationally, there are countries that are still quite behind when it comes to mental health. And I've worked with people from different faith backgrounds, and they've also shared that their communities still haven't moved forward. So I work with somebody within the Sikh community, and they were saying that they still need to sort of address these issues. The leaders in the community aren't necessarily sort of doing much activities as we are. And inshallah, they are sort of moving forward. I think we all need to.
It's good to hear there's some progress. I think there is a lot more awareness. Even something like this, what we're having today, probably in the past, an Islamic organization probably would have talked about general spirituality. Even this series that we're having, I mean, our next session is on depression. It is not. I think the great thing as well is that what I'm seeing is there are more specialists like yourself out there as well who can speak about Islam at a certain level, and at the same time you've got the specialist area that you can connect with, and I think that's been also a great resource for us. I mean, this is our third session, and having spoken and looking ahead into the kind of caliber of people that we're bringing in as well, that we're able to tap onto their services. One thing I was going to say, you mentioned something about the imams and the khutbahs. We very often, when somebody is asked a medical question, the imams would often say, this is a question that you could go to a doctor with. But I don't hear this word, for example, or this sentence being uttered by imams, or this seems like somebody can go to a counselor, or this is something like you could go and get some more support on, whereas you would hear that on other areas. Are you finding that to be the case as well from people that you're speaking to as well? Are they coming to you or they're being referred to by an imam or somebody religious?
Yes, we do. We do get quite a lot of referrals from imams that will share about our services, that they've heard about it, or we've also had a number of different professionals who will talk about it. And I guess I guess it connected me with when I was doing my research, and there was 3 types of Islamic counselling back then. One was going to an imam. So when people go through conflicts in their marriage, in their relationship, the first sort of port of call would be to an imam. But when couples come to us, what they say is that they're giving them the sort of Islamic perspective, but they don't understand the psychological impact that it's having on them. Or they're taking one side and they're not looking at it from the other perspective side. And they don't feel like it's sort of neutral in sometimes in sort of the responses that they're giving, or it doesn't sit with them in their lifestyle and the way they want to be as a couple or as a family. So I guess it connected me on that on some level. But yes, there is definitely a growing awareness. And like I mentioned, we have a number of therapists. We have over 10 therapists, mashallah. We've got accredited courses. And it only came about because people kept asking us, can you please do courses? And we've got so many different people who are combining counseling skills. You see a lot of speakers and imams who now study psychology, and they're combining that with Islam.
We've seen a recent trend of some courses where imams are also attending these. I think that's where do you draw the line? I mean, sometimes even I get a question on fiqh, something related to mental, and they're asking from a spiritual perspective. But whereas with medical, it's a little bit more clearer. So, okay, yeah, this seems like something that you need to go to a doctor about.
Yes.
There's a very fine line between the kind of spiritual health that you were even referring to in terms of adhkar and so on. Like, one of the key issues right now, and we're going to be discussing that more in detail next week, is depression. And it's very easy to say, go and read Allahumma inni a'udhu bika min al-hammi wal-hazan wa a'udhu bika min al-'ajzi wal-kasal, and all of the other du'as that you get about anxiety and so on. But if I was just somebody like myself or an imam or people who are in this field where people are being referred to or people are asking questions, I'm not sure if you have a formula, but I just, where do you draw that line and say, oh, you know what, this is not my area. This is something that you need to go to a counselor or somebody who's a psychotherapist.
Sure. I guess it's really about this idea of just listening to them. And when you start to listen to somebody, you start to realize, oh gosh, they've gone through some difficulties in their life. And I can see that that's a bit complex. And I feel like that's out of my remit, and I need to signpost them to somebody who is more of a professional in that field. And likewise with ourselves, when we get somebody who wants more of an Islamic perspective, a fiqh perspective, we don't provide that. We will refer them and signpost them to a scholar, to an imam, who can then give them that, because that's their expertise.
Yeah. Did you want to finish on that? I just want to kind of come in on the side. It works both ways. Like, actually, sometimes people may come and say, oh, this seems like a big question to me, or something that perhaps an imam could answer, or somebody with religious background.
And the other reality is that, and even when I think about lockdown, we've become far more aware of the reality of loneliness and isolation, and how we are naturally social creatures. We are social beings. We need to have social interaction. And that's one aspect that creates and evokes negativity and sadness in our lives. So yes, we need to turn to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but we also need to have support, and we need to have people around us to help us through our difficulties. We're not perfect, and we're not strong on our own. We sometimes need people around us just to strengthen us, to guide us. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala always talks about being good environments, being positive environments. Turn to people who can help you, who can guide you in their sort of expertise in their field. Like you would go to a doctor. You wouldn't think twice about going to a doctor if you've got a broken leg. You wouldn't say, oh, it's okay, let me try and do it myself. Let me just make my prayer. But we do that when it comes to mental health and emotional health. And I've actually been part of a global mental health summit where we're driving policy change. So we're trying to make mental health the same as physical health. So changing these attitudes is so necessary when it comes to all communities, because we don't have that at present, but we are working towards it.
You touched upon this already, like in terms of the current situation. Dr. Bilal Hassam, he wrote a piece in The Independent. What he was saying was that, and you mentioned about 1 in 4 people suffering from mental health, but he actually said within that you have 1 in 4 suffering from a form of post-traumatic stress disorder, which is termed as PLSD, which is post-lockdown. You know, obviously he's using what comes out of a war, which is loss of life from family and friends, the fear of harm, and the lack of freedom. So, in terms of your experience so far, what do you think we need to prepare for as lockdown is easing in terms of with our own families and our friends, so that we can be as supportive as possible in this current period for our own mental health and for others around us?
Sure. It's an interesting question and quite a complex question as well. It's not so simple. But it's this reality of this is our new normal. And when we start to accept and we embrace this new reality, that's when we will be able to adjust and adapt and accept the circumstances that we're in. And we're going through these stages. So initially we went through that stage of complete lockdown, not able to go out whatsoever. And now we're going through this other stage of transitionally, gradually going back to work, and our children going back to school, and shops are starting to open. So there's so much when it comes to change. Like I mentioned earlier, this idea of transitions, people find that really difficult to adjust to and deal with. So there will be a rise in mental health concerns when it comes to anxiety, when it comes to depression, the way people will view society as well. This idea of if somebody coughs or if somebody sneezes, we're going to be thinking 10 times more compared to before. It wouldn't have meant anything to us at that point. So we're highly more vigilant and cautious. So we're always in that sort of fight and flight mode that some people might go into. And that in itself leads into the sort of traumatic sort of phases that people can go into, constantly alert when they go out. And that in itself has an impact on us if you're in that state all the time. So if you do feel like you are going through that's where we do need that sort of rationality of reminding ourselves that we're not in danger, that there are certain measures in place. You've got the masks, you've got to wash your hands, you social distance. If you do all these things, it will make a big difference. And just the other day, my daughter was talking to me about it and was getting worried about people dying and what will happen when she goes back to school. So again, it was this idea of having to talk to her about mummy, and we all social distance, don't we? We keep a little bit of a distance from everybody. And when we come home, we wash our hands if I take them out for a walk. So it's all these sorts of things, reminding ourselves that we've got all the safety measures in place. And we have to sort of adjust to that change.
Run out of time. Jazakallah khair again for joining us. And I think this is really a beginning of our discussion on a very important topic. And I think what I'm gathering from what you're saying is really creating an atmosphere for these kind of discussions to take place much more open. And it is part of our history, part of our deen to be able to do that. In fact, from what I've learned from you this evening is that our deen actually empowers us to be able to do that much more freely and without any kind of stigma attached. So inshallah, hopefully received a lot from that. Those of you who are joining after this, please restart because you really need to listen to the whole presentation to get a good understanding of this very important topic. Again, Sister Aisha Aslam, those of you who missed it, please go to Sapoon, S-A-K-O-O-N. You can see it on the PowerPoints as well. Go to their website. There's loads more information available. And if you do need support, please do see the website for more details. Jazakallah khair again for your patience right at the beginning with our community as well. Inshallah, take care and stay safe. And Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.